Section 1 of Obermann. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Obermann by Étienne Pivert de Senancour, translated by Arthur Edward Waite, 1857 to 1942. Biographical and Critical Introduction by A.E. Waite, Part 1. The philosophical, descriptive, familiar, and, since it must be admitted, sentimental letters which, under the title of Obermann, have won for themselves a permanent, if not perhaps a high place in the classical literature of France, and are not unknown in England, though they have not been translated previously, were first published in the early years of the 19th century, and are the chief, though not the sole, title to distinction of their author, Étienne Pivert de Senancour. Until the year 1897, this writer, as regards his personality, could have been little more than a pleasant, it may be even a precious memory among a later generation in the French world of periodical literature. Elsewhere he was, and still remains, not even a memory. Few books which in modern times have travelled beyond their birthplace have carried with them so slight a vestige of personal history. The edition of Obermann, which appeared long ago under the auspices of Sainte-Beuve, contained the judgment of that distinguished critic on the claims of the work itself and those of some other productions referable to the same hand, but a mere syllabus of information, and that not entirely correct, concerning the author himself. Later on, the book was again prefaced by Georges Sand, and again in a longer appreciation prefixed to that edition which still circulates at a popular price in France. We had the views of another distinguished personality in literature on the subject of Obermann, but without one word of reference to its authorship. Here in England we owe, most of us, our first knowledge of Senancour to the admiration of Matthew Arnold, whose two poems, addressed to his memory, have kindled many with affection and curiosity concerning a writer of whom he also had next to nothing to tell us, either in the poems themselves, where information was not to be looked for, or in the long note appended to one of them, which once more contains an appreciation, the briefest but most suggestive of them all. There was, in fact, little to dissuade us from believing that Senancour was other than his letters would appear to show him, the recluse of an Alpine region, who on certain rare occasions put forth strange books of meditation, which, passing from his hermitage into the outer world, had not been altogether lost to the world, but had needed some decades for one of them to take its place, and no undue period for the others to pass into oblivion. Sources of information for French readers, it is true, existed, but they were merely the biographical dictionaries or analogous works of reference, which are almost invariably neglected by most readers of literature, and not less by these than by Matthew Arnold himself, or he would never have been in doubt, as he was by the evidence of his poems, regarding the burial place of Senancour. In 1897, M. Jules Le Valois published at Paris a volume of moderate dimensions, entitled A Precursor, Senancour, with unpublished documents, being the result of information which had been afforded him and papers placed at his disposal by the children of Senancour, who were then still surviving. This monograph contains all that we are likely to learn, and its purely biographical information could be reduced within a few pages. In other words, it does not really supplement the biographical dictionaries, except in so far as it corrects, or attempts to correct, a few errors of inference, and its extreme reticence, considering the information which must, one would have thought, have been available, can only be ascribed to a disinclination on the part of his children, or at least of his daughter, towards anything like a life of their father, who seems invariably to have shrunk with extreme sensitiveness from any publicity of that kind. It will be possible, therefore, to dismiss the biographical portion of the present introduction in a short space. Its interest lies wholly in certain analogies and antitheses between the outward life of Senancour and the inward life which is exhibited so fully and remarkably in his imaginary correspondence, reveries, and meditations. Étienne Pivert de Senancour was the son of a contrôleur des rentes, and was born at Paris in 1770, or 27 years later than Louis Claude de Saint-Martin, with whom, as much by analogy as by antithesis, he connects so strangely, as I shall show in its proper place later on. He came of a Lorrain family, and the village of Senancour is still situated in the department of the Meuse. His childhood has been described as sickly, stay-at-home, and wearisome, but though there is no special reason to challenge the statement, it depends chiefly on the biographical fidelity of Obermann, and literally reproduces its words. It may be said, as a general rule, that the biographical dictionaries, if other information failed them, had recourse invariably for their data to the same source. But, as it so happens, the work in question is in more than one respect highly unfaithful from the biographical standpoint. There is no other known source of information, and all reference to the question is omitted by M. Levallois. When the time came for him to be educated, Senancour was placed in the first instance with a curé in the vicinity of Hermonville, and was sent subsequently to the Collège de la Marche. It was probably in the main on account of his state of health and disposition, which did not apparently fit him for more active pursuits, that his father wished him to enter the seminary of Saint-Sulpice as a first step towards the priesthood. But it has also been stated that it was because of his philosophical tendencies, to counteract, in other words, a marked leaning towards the infidelity current at his period. This additional reason is not, of course, rendered specifically improbable, because it was obviously an unwise remedy which sought in a compulsory vocation an antidote to the combined influence of Voltaire, Jean-Jacques, and Boulanger. The son, in any case, rebelled from this parental attempt to set straight his intellectual bias, and though not assuredly from similar philosophical bias, he is said to have been so far abetted by his mother, that she encouraged his flight into Switzerland as a way of escape from the authority and intentions of his father, who, it is further suggested, had otherwise failed to secure the affection of his child. It will be remembered that it is at this period and under similar circumstances that the correspondence opens in Obermann. M. Levallois, however, places the entire account under question, less, however, by explicit denial than by the simple counter-statement that Senancour accompanied his mother on a visit to the country in question, and he fixes the precise date on August 14, 1789. In any case, Senancour appears to have wandered through the greater part of Switzerland, and following a natural inclination, of which we also hear something in the letters, he seems to have devoted himself to painting. While staying at Charrières, though more as a resource and amusement than with any idea of a livelihood. He must have had means of some kind at the commencement, and it was perhaps when they were on the verge of exhaustion that he drifted into communication with a family, said to have been noble, and then living on an estate in the canton of Fribourg. It was here that the first crisis of his life awaited him. One of the members of the Freiburg family was a girl who, like himself, was unhappy, and like him also was on the verge of embracing a compulsory vocation, which was in her case a distasteful marriage. The lady was Mademoiselle de Daguet, a connection of the Jouffroy family. The point of sympathy which I have indicated was not long before it ripened into intimacy, and though the precise nature of that intimacy has not been stated, Senancour, it is suggested, came to the conclusion that he had compromised her, and as a point of honor rather than as the outcome of affection, despite the bond of their affinity, he married her. He was at this time barely 20 years old, was possessed of no fortune, and had no opportunity of acquiring one during the throes of the French Revolution. Whether he continued to live in the family of the lady, but if not, how they subsisted and where they settled for the time, are points which seem unknown even to M. Le Valois. We are told only that the date of the marriage was 1790, that its subsequent history was not a happy one, and by others that it was responsible later on for a distantly similar episode, that of Fonsalbe, which occurs toward the end of Obermann. The last point, it may be hoped, is conjectural only, and has perhaps no better foundation than the fact that this imaginary character is also represented as having a son and daughter. The comparison is otherwise unfortunate, and not one which we could wish to be instituted by Senancour about a wife who was already dead. It will be remembered that Fonsalbe was induced to contract a marriage, partly on the ground of the affection which a lady was said to have entertained for him by her father, and partly from certain considerations which reflect detrimentally on her. Of the alleged analogy, M. Le Valois fortunately knows nothing, or has concealed it out of consideration for the feelings of his principal informant. The flight of Senancour into Switzerland, which changed without apparently improving his state of life, and while it saved him from a calling which he disliked, precipitated him towards a destiny which seems to have been no less unsuited, had another embarrassing effect upon his future. He was proscribed as an émigré, and this proscription meant danger in the event of his return to France. According to the early accounts, he was, however, driven to return, partly by a longing to revisit his mother, whose sympathy had assisted him in his first struggles. M. Le Valois, on the other hand, indicates that throughout the Revolution he was continually going and coming between Switzerland and France to watch over the safety of a heritage which various mischances reduced nevertheless to a very small amount. All authorities are agreed that these visits brought him a great deal of trouble and danger. He was arrested, sometimes on the suspicion that he was a refractory priest, sometimes on the ground of emigration, and it is even said that he was more than once in danger of death. The next date that it is possible to name in his history is 1796, when his parents appear to have died almost simultaneously, and their loss was followed speedily by that of his wife, who passed away after a lingering complaint. She had apparently no money in her own right, and the estate of his parents, which should have come down to Senancour, was in the end diverted by the trouble of the time. Thus deprived of resources on which he had counted, he was compelled to renounce permanently the life of solitude and retreat among the Swiss Alps, to which disposition and election seemed to have alike drawn him. Much against his will, he took up his abode in Paris, at one time in the Rue de la Cerisaie, and thenceforth devoted himself to journalism. I should add that there is some divergence as to the date when this new life began for him. One of the memorials states that after the death of his wife and parents he became still more of a dreamer and still more solitary in his habits. This suggests the return from France to Switzerland, which we find in Obermann, rather than the boulevards and periodical literature. According to Levallois, Senancour, despite the fact of his marriage, led his accustomed wandering life after the Reign of Terror, and in 1797 was in the neighbourhood of Senlis, where, at the house of a friend, he wrote the first draft of his Rêveries. Obermann was begun in Paris in 1801 and terminated in 1803 in the neighbourhood of Fribourg. In any case, the change came, and it is to the period subsequent thereto that his greatest literary activity belongs. He co-operated in the editorship of La Minerve Française, and was on the staff of the Mercure du XIXe siècle. He also contributed to L'Abeille and Le Constitutionnel. Another account represents him as identified with the literary movement of France, chiefly on the liberal side. In 1828 he contributed to the Revue Encyclopédique. He was also one of the editors of Rab's Biographie universelle des contemporains, and it should be noted that the account of Senancour published in this compilation, while it is one of the most appreciative of the contemporary notices which we have regarding him, is also the most reticent and indeed completely silent as regards all his private life. I should mention also that yet another account represents him as not issuing from his solitude till after the Restoration, that is, subsequently to 1814, in which case several of his most important works would have been the product of a second sojourn in Switzerland. This account further states that it was only at a calmer period, namely when there was no longer danger to the émigré, that he took up his abode in France, but the facts are against this view. The full list of Senancour's works is as follows: one initial publication, not particularized as to title, but described as a failure, being omitted. Its attribution is somewhat legendary, and it is unknown to Levallois. 1. Reveries on the primitive nature of man, on sensations, on the means of happiness which they indicate, and on the social state which would conserve the most of its primordial forms. 1798-99. Demi 8vo, pages 18, 340. Of this work there are two later editions, the second in 1809 and the third in 1833, the text being subjected on each occasion to very considerable alteration. It would seem also that there was a pirated or forged edition, which is mentioned by M. Levallois, but as to which there are no particulars. 2. Obermann, 2 volumes, 1804, Demi 8vo, pages 8, 10, 384 and 382, republished with preface by Sainte-Beuve, 1833, and again with preface by Georges Sand. The last is a posthumous edition, reprints of which are still circulated in France. A considerable portion of the original edition of Obermann was transferred to the second edition of the Rêveries. 4. Of Love considered in the True Laws and in the Social Forms of the Union of the Sexes, 1806, 8vo, pages 16, 287. A second edition was published in 1808, with many changes and additions, and a third with new subtitle and further alterations in 1829, fourth edition 1834. 5. Valembre, a play, 1807. 6. Plain Observations addressed to the Congress of Vienna by an inhabitant of the Vosges, 1814, 8vo, pages 32. 7. Second and final letter from an inhabitant of the Vosges on Messieurs Bonaparte, de Chateaubriand, Grégoire, Baruel, etc. 1814, 8 octavo, pages 36. 8. Two brochures, published in 1814 and 1815, and respectively entitled June and July 14th, 8 octavo, pages 8. 9. On Napoleon during the 100 Days, another brochure, published in 1815, 8 octavo, pages 16. 10. Critical observations on the work entitled Genius of Christianity, followed by some reflections on the writings of M. de Bonald relative to the law of divorce, 1816, 8 octavo. 11. Free meditations of an unknown recluse on detachment from the world and on other objects of religious morality, 1819, demi, 8 octavo, pages 20, 432. A second edition appeared in 1830 and a third in 1834. 12. Summary of the History of China, 1824, second edition, 1825, 36 leaves. 13. Moral and Religious Traditions of Various Nations, 1825, 36 leaves, second edition, 1827. 14. The History of Rome, 2 volumes, that dealing with the Roman Republic appeared in 1827, and that concerning the Roman Empire in 1828, 36 leaves. 15. Isabel, a series of letters addressed to Clemence, 1833, demi, 8 octavo, pages 304. 16. A Vocabulary of Simple Truths, 1834, being number 108 of a popular library, Bibliothèque Populaire, under the editorship of A. Jasson de Gransagne. One of these works, namely the Summary of Moral Traditions, brought him for a second time into conflict with authority, but only on the publication of the second edition, when in the year 1827 he was subjected to a prosecution on the part of the correctional police, because in the work under question he had spoken of Christ merely as a young man of wisdom. Judgment was pronounced against him, with a fine of 300 francs and 9 months' imprisonment. This decision was reversed by a superior court on January 22nd, 1828, apparently to the great joy of the liberal section of the French press. Senancour's general opinions on matters of revealed religion appear a year later in his contribution already mentioned to the Encyclopedic Review, being an article on a work of Salvador relative to the institutions of Moses, in which he agrees with that forgotten writer, who has ceased to be even a name, that as regards the best maxims of morality, there are none in the books of the New Testament which are not found in David, Solomon, Isaiah, or even in the Pentateuch, a criticism from which nothing seems to follow but the imbecility of the period, to which alone it would be possible to suggest, as a point eligible for controversy, that morality began with Christ. End of section 1. Section 2 of Obermann. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Obermann by Étienne Pivert de Senancour, translated by Arthur Edward Waite, 1857 to 1942. Biographical and Critical Introduction by A. E. Waite, Part 2. The whole life of Senancour during his residence in Paris, which we may take to have lasted practically from about the year 1803 until his death in 1846, was one of a long struggle with poverty. His works, though numerous and not entirely without distinction even in his own day, could have attained in most cases only a moderate circulation, and there is nothing to suggest that, assuming they paid his booksellers, they could have been a source of any substantial profit to himself. Like the majority of professional authors, whose best work is either above the level of their epoch or is for some other reason confined in its appeal only to restricted circles, he derived most of his subsistence from what we now understand as hack work, writing, as I have already indicated, for the press of the day, assisting in the compilation of dictionaries, and worst of all, because of the labor that it must have involved, undertaking single-handed the manufacture of historical treatises. There is evidence to show that his poverty and constriction were for long a very bitter experience, because at the opening of his life he had every reason to suppose that he would be more tenderly dealt with by fortune. In the end, he is said to have become resigned to his straitened ways, though for one moment, as we learn from his latest biographer, he dreamed of some material activity which, curiously enough, seems to have connected itself with the idea of following Napoleon into Egypt. In spite of his practical obscurity, he appears to have had many acquaintances, if not friends, among literary men perhaps more distinguished than himself at their period, though his own work has now survived most of them. It would appear that the Legion of Honor was ultimately conferred upon him, though the cross itself never came into his hands. He was a candidate in 1832, and on several later occasions, for election as a member of the Academy of Moral Sciences, and he was actually for a considerable period associated with a minor body termed the Historical Institute. He was acquainted with Vignet, Georges Sand, Benjamin Constant, and Sainte-Beuve. He owed something to assistance from these names, and it was possibly such literary rather than political influence exercised in high places which ultimately obtained for him a government pension, the amount of which, however, has not transpired. If we may believe that, as a result of this annuity, he was relieved to some extent from the necessity of journalism, such advantage was, it may be feared, counterbalanced by considerable suffering towards the close of his life. Though some doubt is cast upon the point by Le Valois, all earlier biographers agree in saying that during the whole period of his residence in Paris his health was more or less bad, which fact the panegyrists of the biographical dictionaries assign to two causes. Firstly, his early devotion to the very strong white wine of Le Valais, and secondly, a fall, together with a long immersion in an icy torrent. Such authority as may be held to inhere in Obermann exists in that work for both explanations, which must be taken for what they are worth. Senancour died at St. Cloud on January 10, 1846, having, it is said, previously lost the use of his limbs through successive attacks of an aggravated form of gout. One of the informants of Le Valois alludes to his special desire that no priest or minister belonging to any of the official communions should be called to his death-bed, but other authority outside his general intellectual tendencies does not exist for the statement. His portrait was published in L'Illustration on January 31, and the obituary notice which accompanies it describes him as small in stature, refined of feature, with an air of distinction and youth, which he preserved to the most advanced age. He had a broad, open forehead, and fair hair of fine texture. Senancour left two children, as already mentioned, a son and daughter. The son followed a military career, and the daughter, named Eulalie, long acted as the secretary of her father, and wrote subsequently a variety of unimportant stories, designed, I believe, for the amusement of children, besides doing various journalistic work. Such, briefly, was the life of Senancour, and it justifies the statement made at the beginning that, apart from any title to consideration which will be found in his writings, it is devoid of special features of interest. We cannot expand its outlines so that it shall exceed the common struggle for subsistence in the common life of letters, and it was enringed by the interests and hampered by the tendencies of one of the most soulless periods in the history of modern times. Its few interests do not escape from the charge to which the epoch is open, a somewhat pusillanimous flight, or at least departure, to escape a calling which the fugitive did not reject because it had fallen from its high estate, and for which at its best he was infinitely unfit, a silly connection, perhaps even a squalid liaison, an unhappy and mismanaged marriage, the humble life of a journalist embedded in the disenchanting traditions of 1815 and circa. These are not titles to consideration or remembrance, and if it can be shown that the Senancour who wrote Obermann and the Free Meditations was really nothing more than the Senancour who was in agreement with Salvador, who was prosecuted by the correctional police, who compiled mournful historical sketches of China and Rome, interspersed with moral reflections and designed to be useful, who in fine drank the white wine of La Valais and died of the gout, then to translate Obermann would be more inexcusable than to have written it in 1804, because we have now means of knowing better. It is my intention, however, to show that there was a Senancour who did not appear on the Boulevard or in the Mercury of the 19th century, though in many respects he may be said to carry a not less deplorable baggage than the wallet of Judas Iscariot. At that best, however, he was exotic to his period. He was, in fact, a man of vision, and he belongs at his best to eternity. Before proceeding further, it may be deemed desirable, in the interests of the reader who is probably unacquainted at first hand with Obermann and knows nothing of Senancour otherwise than by uncertain report, to put on record as a kind of credentials what has been said of him, both in and out of his own country, by a few distinguished personalities who were familiar themselves with Obermann, and at least within certain limits came to regard it, like the writer of this notice, as a note-book or ordinal of a soul errant on its way unguided through the world of life and time, but amidst all darkness, wavering, circumambulation, and unrest, still looking only towards eternity, and in that darkness and in that doubt realistically conscious of the infinite. There will be no need to go far in search of such witnesses, nor yet to multiply the evidences, and perhaps under the circumstances the plainer way will be to take an unpretentious course and give simple quotations. Matthew Arnold says that the profound inwardness, the austere sincerity of his principal work, Obermann, the delicate feeling for nature which it exhibits, and the melancholy eloquence of many passages of it, have attracted and charmed some of the most remarkable spirits of this, the 19th century. The stir of all the main forces by which modern life is and has been impelled lives in the letters of Obermann. The dissolving agencies of the 18th century, the fiery storm of the French Revolution, the first faint promise and dawn of that new world which our own time is but now more fully bringing to light, all these are to be felt, almost touched there. To me, indeed, it will always seem that the impressiveness of this production can hardly be rated too high. Sainte-Beuve describes Senancour as a pupil of Rousseau, but original and transformed. Of Obermann, he says that it responds only vaguely to the author's biography, but fully to his psychology. Of the work itself, he says that it is the true type of the moral situation, of which René represents a moment only, and that in an idealized manner. And again, in the Portrait Contemporain, Tome I, he describes it as profound rather than beautiful, and as the book of the suffering majority of souls, their desolating history, their mysterious and uncompleted poem. Then of the author in Chateaubriand et son groupe, he says, M. de Senancour lived as a man of conscience and of virtue. He has not reaped glory, but he has had friends. He has had admirers, few, secret, but devoted after their manner, and impassioned. He has his secret posterity, which will remain faithful to him. The destiny depicted in Obermann is described by George Sand as majestic in its misery and sublime in its infirmity. Its highest and most permanent value consists in its psychological data, and it is principally from this point of view that it should be examined and interrogated. Granting, as regards its standpoint, that the descriptive and lyrical beauties of his poem are frequently troubled by the intervention of philosophical discussions or worldly cynicisms, the natural gaiety of his character, the august recollection of his most habitual thoughts, soon inspire new hymns which are unequalled for austere piety and wild grandeur. In the last resource, it may be doubted whether any of these criticisms do more than touch upon the fringe of the real issues which transpire in the consideration of Senancour and the particular revelations which are made to us in those of his works which have been singled out from much that is regrettable and more that is futile, as containing the message and secret romance of his inmost soul. The English critic dwells upon the sentimental aspects and the circumstances of the period which made Obermann possible as a production of the human mind. Sainte-Beuve hints at one source of intellectual derivation, and adds what is true enough, but is not all nor even the greatest part of the truth, namely, that the book is the history of the growth of a mind. The important point about Obermann is that it is a soul recounting its experiences, recording its speculations, and registering its questionings in the valley of the shadow. George Sand reduces this large view within the dimensions of a curt metaphysical statement couched in technical phraseology, which is too bald to convey a suggestion, and then falls back upon a literary criticism which, for the rest, is extremely true and must be almost obvious to any reader. The brief citations I have given will not less carry their full weight, if only in the scales of the ordinary mind, because they are quoted in connection with names which are of those that have power to dispense and sometimes to withhold reputations. There are others that might be mentioned, and perhaps one or two whose judgment would be more to the real purpose, but enough has been indicated for the present object, and it will be permissible to pass on at once to the direct consideration of the true questions that are at issue. In the first place, as regards the intimate connection which has been established, partly from the paucity of other materials and partly following the lead of at least one illustrious critic, between Senancour as he lived in the world and the hero of Obermann as his outward and inward natures are depicted in the book. Obermann must not be regarded as the biography of its author, but rather as an event in his development. Some of its incidents are, however, explained naturally by circumstances in his outward life. One is inclined, indeed, to speculate as to why, seeing that the analogies are in certain respects so close, there were other modifications introduced which remove it, without assignable reason, from the drift of his personal history. The most considerable and obvious distinction consists in the fact that Obermann is presented as a celibate, while Senancour, at the age of his hero, was already married, hastily, unwisely, and unhappily. The reason for this principal distinction may perhaps, however, be discerned. Obermann is to some extent circumstanced as Senancour, at the period when he wrote it, could have wished to be. Amidst all his weariness, his dejection, his Disillusioned, doubtless equally dejected and disillusioned, Senancour could have wished his own lines cast, as they were not, at least permanently at the period when Obermann was written, in the same uplifted, lonely places and the same modest ease of circumstance. He may not at that time have been actually working on the press for his bread, for, as already seen and following his private memoranda, Obermann was written in 1801 at Paris, and in 1802 and part of the next year at Fribourg. But he knew that Paris, to which he returned permanently about 1803, was his destination, that journalism was his destiny, and that thenceforth he could transfer himself merely in imagination to Saint-Séphirin, to Le Valais, to Vevey, living the life of a recluse and a contemplator of the ages, yet possessed of what to him would have been the purse of Fortunatus, namely, a modest competence, an income secured to him yearly. Now, as he dreamed thus of financial ease, so I fear that the unhappiness of his married life, fully demonstrated in the only life which we have of him, led him also to picture as something comparatively desirable the celibacy of a young man at the same time yearning for companionship, intimacy, and love. As indicated already, other departures are less easy to account for, but there would be no purpose in enumerating them here. The only point that is of importance to establish is that Obermann is the spiritual history of Senancour, the life of his soul laid bare, and this is also its preeminent title to consideration and the valid ground for offering it to English readers without abridgment. It must be confessed, as will be seen subsequently, that it contains many perishable elements, and not a few which are indeed long since dead. It is, notwithstanding, a great book of the soul, and this is not less its true and proper description, nor is it spiritually less valuable because it is a book of the soul in darkness, a darkness broken by flashes of strange light fitfully, a darkness not wanting the permanent scintillation of far stars in the zenith and palpitating through the height and breadth with the sense and sadness of the infinite. One of the chief purposes of this introduction is to show that this spiritual darkness of Senancour, as it is made palpable to us in Obermann, was at length kindled or infiltrated by a certain morning light in a later composition, and this in such a way as to make it past all doubt that he did at length enter into a measure of the possession of the day. It may be advisable at this point to correct one error of appreciation to which I believe that some currency has been given, less in the criticisms of Obermann, which have appeared in books or periodicals where no one has been sufficiently serious to concern themselves in any careful analysis, than in an unwritten impression prevailing among the admirers of Senancour, who are not professed critics. The letters are not, as sometimes supposed, to be taken, nor are they perhaps even in the intention of the author altogether designed to be taken, as the unpremeditated outpourings of a genuine correspondence. There are certainly several passages which could be quoted in support of this view, but they appear, I think, merely as the notion of a moment, and are not really borne out by that which precedes or follows them. Even giving full credit for the general fact that the guise of such a correspondence is on the whole tolerably carried out, it is still, as need scarcely be said, not to be taken seriously. Senancour was discoursing to himself, and of his own mystery, and of the enswathing mystery of outward things. If there are parts here and there that possess the unpremeditated accent of unconventional letter writing, they cannot be regarded as numerous in respect of the bulk of the work, and in any broad judgment it must be held that the unconcerted accent is betrayed at every point. The letters are for the most part highly ornate productions. There are inspired pages which, like all inspirations, are unconcerted, but there are many dull, trivial, and tedious pages which, if they strove after such an impression, would not be redeemed by success therein. But speaking generally, there is not, I think, success of any marked kind. In other words, the colloquial parts are of less interest, and if they are held to be worth including in a translation, it can only be for the sake of completeness and for psychological coherence. Such portions are the burden of the translator, and it cannot be altogether inequitable if they do not prove light to the reader. In translating, I have, so far as it seemed to me possible, set aside the colloquial in favour of the philosophical style, and I do not consider that this course has added, at least unnecessarily, to the heaviness of a part of the work, for much and too much of it is of this order in the original. There is full proof that my general standpoint in this matter is correct, and it lies in a fact to which allusion has already been made in the bibliographical part of this notice, namely, that the second edition of the Rêveries swells the number of its pages, as compared with the first, by the simple method of lifting whole sections from Obermann, a process which would have been, to my mind, inconceivable had the latter work been of the unpremeditated order that is claimed for it by those who regard it as an unconventional correspondence. The Rêveries, as need hardly be said, are of a highly philosophical and indeed recondite order, and the fact that in the author's opinion they could be made to blend with selections from Obermann is proof positive that Obermann really, for the most part, and certainly as regards the best therein, is also of the philosophical order. I shall venture now, in the interests of clearness, to put in a summary manner a few heads of the considerations which it is desirable to lay to heart in undertaking any serious reflections upon Obermann. It is a work of initiation in more than the sense intended by the author, who makes use of this idea in his preliminary observations, and it is offered in its English guise only to those who are initiated or who are capable thereof. The psychological condition which it depicts, taken in conjunction with other fields of experience into which the author entered at a later stage of his life, offers ground for reflection which would be unassimilable by the ordinary reader or the ordinary thoughtful man, or even by persons disposed to self-improvement along recognized and conventional lines. Obermann is wholly and entirely distinct from what is understood usually by the French memoir or French correspondance intime. It is a book of the sorrows and aspirations of the soul, not less important, as already pointed out, because it depicts the soul in darkness and inhibition, and if we are unable to affirm that Senancour reached any term of real spiritual experience, we shall still leave him at a hopeful stage upon the road. Having cited one fact to show that Obermann cannot be regarded either as a real correspondence or as a successful attempt at the imitation of one, I should add in justice, and perhaps in further proof of my point, that it would also be erroneous to describe it conventionally as an imaginary correspondence. Its epistolary form is to some extent accidental, or a matter of convenience. It is the spiritual history of Senancour up to a certain point. A second part was promised or suggested, which never appeared as such, but the work entitled Meditations of an Unknown Recluse is the real second part of Obermann, because it is the sequel of his spiritual history. If it is possible to justify at all a translation of Senancour, and on this point as a whole the justification must be Obermann itself, such an undertaking at the present time may be held to have a peculiar fitness, for there is more than one respect in which we may be said to have awakened from some such period of disillusion as prevailed at the beginning of the 19th century. There is no exact parallel, and the attempt to institute a specific, much less minute, comparison would be foolish. The analogies, however, subsist, and in so far as they are accompanied by antitheses, Obermann does not less stand out in the light of these as an important object lesson. It is, in fact, the lesson of an escape. The condition of Senancour, as we may take him to have pictured it in these letters, is no illogical consequence of a Belfast address. That address has now been definitely buried with all its forms and ways, more permanently and more effectually than Senancour, for some obscure reason, wished to entomb Obermann when he prefixed to the second edition of his Reveries the express statement that Obermann would never be reprinted. As a fact, it was reprinted, and moreover re-edited and enlarged, which will not happen to the Belfast Address, unless indeed its reproduction should be required some time or other, also as an object lesson. The period of disillusion from which we have emerged must not be represented exactly as a product of that address, for the address was rather a product of the aspect from which life and its problems were regarded, and that aspect also produced disillusion. The keynote of the period was materialism, a word which is now rapidly losing all its offensive meaning, because the intellectual attitude which it symbolized is now dead. The corresponding attitude at the close of the 18th century is represented by the Philosophical Dictionary by Condorcet, Diderot, and Boulanger. The disillusion of that attitude was the ice which, according to Matthew Arnold, had entered the soul of Senancour. He contrived to emerge into another temperature, and to discern the portents, at least, of that star of truth and justice which was expected by Saint Martin, just as we have ourselves slipped somehow through dark seas into the brighter waters of the 20th century. The psychological fact of Senancour is not therefore without its interest and importance. The qualities which ultimately brought him out of the constraint and weariness are those which have saved us, and there is a sense in which, even at this day, his state and his story hold up the glass to our own. So much by way of analogy in rough delineation. As regards the antithesis, it is sufficient to say that the fires and fervours of the French Revolution stand out in contrast to the close of the 19th century, the final decades of which, in spite of wars and rumours of wars, of standing armies, of grave social and other questions, were years of peace, characterized by progressive amelioration in the physical order, by a singular equality of general temperament, and hence also by few enthusiasms. Matthew Arnold, when enumerating the seers of his troubled day, found 3 only who had contrived to see the path before them, and one of these was Senancour. As to how he had so contrived, I do not know that Arnold could have given a correct answer. It is certainly not, as he seems to suggest, through some secret of passive endurance. Strive not, die also thou. To quench is not to satisfy. The key is given rather by the inscription on the tomb of Senancour: Eternity, be thou my refuge. It was the consciousness of the soul, of the things which are not seen and eternal, of God and our part in God and immortality, which brought Senancour to the enjoyment of a certain measure of the light which has come upon the souls of a growing concourse of persons in the present day, is transforming thought, and must ultimately transform life, And though in a certain sense the fullest experience of this light is almost necessarily reserved for a few, it is also destined to influence very largely the age and the world at large. End of section 2. Section 3 of Obermann. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Obermann by Étienne Pivert de Senancour, translated by Arthur Edward Waite, 1847 to 1942. Biographical and Critical Introduction by A. E. Waite, Part 3. How a man who was intellectually conspicuous for his period came to be taught of the spirit at the beginning of the 19th century, and what are the lessons which he leaves us, either directly or by inference, cannot fail to be of interest. And to elucidate these points, it will be necessary to take a short survey of the letters of Obermann, their beauties and their defects, designed to exhibit the views of their author at the period of that book on subjects of real importance. There are at the beginning one or two critical points which, for the sake of clearness, had better be dealt with out of hand, as at one or another stage notice must be taken of them. I have indicated already that there is a good deal of waste substance in Obermann, and to defend this would be inexcusable to educated discernment, and fairly impossible even for the least intelligent and discriminate of its admirers. This waste substance may be written down authoritatively as those parts which were possibly intended to give an accent of realism to the correspondence. Where there is a lighter vein in Obermann, there is, by comparison at least, a poorness which tends frequently to become conspicuous, and in some occasional attempts at persiflage is not short of pitiable, as, for example, the distinction between what is proved and what is certain in the 47th letter. Why it has been thought advisable to retain all this laboured and weary trifling has also been indicated. Obermann is a work of continuity, and it would be at the expense of the whole book if it were separated into detached essays, isolated reflections, or descriptive passages. It would have been much easier and pleasanter to have cut out all that I have myself found vapid and tedious. But such a personal feeling is not safe as a criterion. And in this notebook of a specialist in self-analysis, each of the occult fraternity to whom he makes appeal in his preface may be content to mark that which impresses them and leave what remains to the others. The whole is useful as an event in the growth of a mind which at length found other supports, escaping from the weariness of its own limitations and attaining something of heaven and light. The reader must therefore deal with the work as a whole, accepting what seems to him best, over which I trust that he will be in agreement with me, and confessing for the rest that there are 1,000 things which he must be prepared to excuse in Obermann, which will be also those indicated by me if he is the reader for whom I have rendered it. As to others who are beyond my care and knowledge, there may be any number of the uninitiated who are incapable of initiation, for whom vapidities and commonplaces, declaimed from the height of vulgar thought, may form excellent mental pabulum, and who may find some food in Senancour, should the unalterable providence of books permit them to come across Obermann. Also, if there should be any one at this day to whom the peculiar anti-Christian standpoint of Senancour may by chance appeal, it is possible that he will take it to his heart of hearts. Let all of us, however, who aspire to be true sons of the doctrine and the light, forgive Senancour as best we can all that is opposed to this light, his melancholy fantasies on the vanity of fleeting enjoyments, less for their tincture of pessimism than because of their commonplace, together with his halting eloquence in 100 natural descriptions, and the final impenitence of sentiment, which can tolerate in the 90th letter a suggestion of dietary for the disorders of the soul. Another stricture which must, I think, be passed upon Obermann is that, after the epoch of the sorcerers, the grimoire of Honorius, and the dominion of Abracadabra, he was perhaps among the first genuine apostles of mere words. His pages are often a running stream of sound, not always too attractive in its melody, voicing too often the vaguest quality of sense, using more than is endurable the terminology of the nebulous and unsignificant, constructions, in a word, without tangible meaning. A mere occasional dullness is, of course, to be expected in such letters, and is therefore tolerable. Many passages are inapplicable to the modern standpoint, many ideas are exploded, and many disquisitions could have been of very little account, even at the period when they were written, as, for example, in the 52nd letter, the discourse on the influence of climates in the modification of peoples. But these things are not worse or more dry than many pages of Amiel or Maribach Kirchhoff, which find favour today, or than the Journal of a Self-Observer by Lavater, which had its readers, and we may presume its admirers, seeing that this too was translated in a generation that has passed. Occasionally it may be questioned whether my apology for an unselected translation can be held to cover certain sections, whether in the 72nd letter there can be really an excuse for the egregious conversation with a nameless officer who ordered, but in what way does not appear, a life which seems to have been quite trivial with a view to an enjoyment, but of what also fails to transpire, unaccompanied by a weariness which should have at least overcome his listener. But Obermann was so dull and so weary that it did not increase his dullness or add to his exhaustion. And the same doubt is raised by the 52nd letter, which offers a depressing account of a depressing journey undertaken by a disillusioned idler and a tiresome young man of promise who does not like Paris, but permits himself to perambulate its environs. And yet, as a redeeming feature, we may note a certain touch of nature and a certain measure of insight into character. Saving clauses of this kind might be introduced at many points of a criticism which would otherwise be severe. Not infrequently, when dealing even with the most unpromising materials, and in none too promising a manner, a sudden light breaks forth and illuminates the whole. In Letter 21 there is an unspeakable disquisition upon beauty, beauty as it was conceived of all periods in the universe by that hopeless period which succeeded Diderot, inhibited as it was from every grace and sacrament, while Obermann himself, when he intellectualized, was no less in excommunication and under anathema. But even here, amidst barren discourse, without unction, a sudden inspiration comes upon him. He casts aside all profitless distinctions, and identifies for a moment the sentiment of beauty with the perception of the infinite. In some cases we get help of a certain sort which was obviously undesigned by the author, as, for example, in the second fragment appended to Letter 35. Obermann discoursing on ethics is Obermann in a moist mist of unilluminated depression. He is never more commonplace than when he is crying down the commonplace conventions of that which passed for wisdom at the cold daybreak of the 19th century, and yet he helps us to recognize the futility of that wisdom, less on account of its conventions than its essential hollowness. We have touched hitherto only upon one side of the field of criticism which is opened out by Obermann. We have dealt with that which is nugatory or unimportant. We have now to consider the work as a whole, and make also some reference to certain specific points which are philosophically of sufficient importance, or suggestively of sufficient interest to make it worth while to indicate the particular errors of the writer. Regarding the letters as a whole, Matthew Arnold is, if I remember, the only critic of Obermann who points out that it is in the main a work of the sentimental school. As such, it connects not only with the Confessions of Rousseau, with the Nouvelle Héloïse, very markedly with the Sorrows of Werther, in a lesser degree with René, Attila, and the Indian Cottage, but also with more than one prototype of the sentimental school in England, with Mackenzie and his Man of Feeling, and it must be added with Mrs. Radcliffe, even with the Romance of the Forest, and the Mysteries of Udolpho. The statement has an air of absurdity, for the delineation of the states of the soul has at first sight no common ground for comparison with the shrines of Gothic superstition, the ruined abbeys, and the mountain fortresses of this school of romance, and still less, if possible, with its peculiar management of mysteries. But so far as Obermann is a work of feeling, it recalls, and that pointedly, the characteristic quality of feeling which is found in the sentimental school, and especially in Mrs. Radcliffe. Let any one compare the temperament which manifests in the 6th letter with the disposition of Valancourt in the Mysteries of Udolpho, and generally the pleasing melancholy which was the chief delight of Obermann, with the same favourite condition as it is described times out of number in connection with the heroines of Mrs. Radcliffe, and they will see that it is the same temperament, minus the religious sentiment, elementary as it was, which inspired the vapid and tiresome creations of one who was once described and accepted as a mighty magician bred and nourished by the Florentine muses, amidst all the dreariness of enchantment. Obermann is sufficiently many-sided to make any summary account of it not so much difficult as impossible. This is partly, but not fully, to be accounted for by the fact that it is a book of moods, many moods, but with one only that is really dominant, and this is the mood of weariness. For many persons, therefore, its handiest description would be that it is the diary of an ennuyé. But this is not at all adequate, for in the first place it never entered into the heart of the ordinary ennuyé to conceive the weariness of Obermann, nor secondly, in the midst of that weariness, to conceive the thoughts of Obermann. He is rather like an outworn pilgrim of the ages, who, at length brought face to face with eternity, exclaims, "Is this all?" Yet he is in no sense as a god who has grown weary, for of many trifles there are some which tire him, and yet some which divert him. He was so alive to minute inconveniences and small disappointments that he thought it worth while to devote a letter to the necessity of a boat on Lake Chesil for the benefit of the invalids at the baths, and for his own pleasure, letter 57. Others will regard themselves as having grasped the key to the entire work when they have become satisfied that the spleen, the exhaustion, the pessimism, the disappointment of Obermann were all consequent on the fact that he was out of employment, and that he carried through the waste places of the immortal soul the burden of his idleness, emblazoned with the legend of the mendicant mechanic. We've got no work to do. I will not deny that the inmost character of Obermann might be open to him who could explain precisely why he enjoyed the slow wheeling of a barrow laden with grapes, and yet withered under the tardiness and postponements of the law in a suit the issue of which did not interest, however much it might concern him. But though want of some defined end of a practical kind in life was from time to time a matter of regret with Obermann, or more correctly of speculation as to whether it might have acted as an anodyne, he was too shrewd an observer to be deceived by the colourable imitations and substitutes which are offered by the world in place of the one thing needful. We may note in this connection the practical wisdom at the close of the 76th letter, wherein he felicitates himself upon the possession of a moderate sufficiency, by which he could live without ostentation, and affirms that an independent fortune is one of the great means of happiness, and even of wisdom, a sane view in comparison with which the childish philosophy of bread-winning for its own sake is not only childish but mischievous. For myself, I have already indicated that Obermann is the experience amidst finite things of a consciousness that has been awakened to the things that are infinite and eternal. But I have suggested it as a palmary point of great importance, not as an exhaustive description. He tells us, Letter 3, that he was in search of other manners and a new nature, but I think personally that he sought, without knowing it, the perfect life of the transcendental world. In many respects, Obermann is a book of the lamentations of the soul on a journey from the centre, while it knows well that its rest remains at the centre. There are yet those who will describe Obermann, because he does so himself practically, as a hermit hungry for companionship, especially for the sight, the society, the intimacy of a true friend. But failing that, grasping at the chance of securing the friend of that true friend, who also and more especially is the brother of a woman whom he has loved. By many subtle hints, many unintended and incomplete revelations, many indirect openings and insights, we discern how much this love and the disappointment which ensued upon it have contributed not merely to his disenchantment, but to his permanent loss in life, his intellectual enervation, and the constriction of all his destiny. But although it is obvious that Obermann, like the French mystic of a generation before, to whom I shall have occasion to recur, very obviously and earnestly desired, even while he misdoubted, the married state, yet the book is not the product of the dreams and the longings of a celibate. And in this connection we should remember, firstly, that Senancour himself had been married, and secondly, that no general description of Obermann, which would not be true psychologically as regards Senancour, can be taken to represent it adequately. There is yet one other description and one explanation which is not less entitled to our respect, because we are most of us unable to accept it, at least as the whole truth, and this is the explanation of the Catholic, who will discern in Obermann the history of a soul which has gone utterly astray, because it has broken from the anchor of the faith. I am describing this point of view somewhat conventionally, so as to be true to the spirit of the criticism, which invariably finds its expression in a convention. The case is as strong as the assumption upon which it rests, and it is only by realizing that it gives expression to but a part of the truth that it is possible to set it aside. Otherwise it puts a circle about the entire experience of Obermann and accounts for it page after page and line by line. The assumption is that pious and solicitous parents reared him in the true church and designed him for the highest vocation which can be offered within the pale of its union, but that, at the age when he should have acted upon the choice, he had already unsettled his mind, otherwise inexperienced and ill-equipped by the desultory reading of current infidel literature, that he had conceived in consequence a strong aversion from the life of sanctity, that he broke all ties to escape from it, and that, once having corrupted his faith, he was henceforth unstable, restless, unprofitable to himself and the world. The skilled hand could extract passage after passage from Obermann as proof positive that he suffered simply the common misery and daily experience of the soul apart from God, which at the same time has once known the light and has therefore no excuse for deserting it. If this book, therefore, should fall into the hands of convinced Catholics, it cannot fail to offer them a signal instance for the fortification of their faith, and the explanation for them will be at once complete and unchallengeable. Within its own lines there are many of us who will, I trust, be disposed to regard it as entirely excellent. Indeed, speaking for the school which I represent, it only requires to be restated in the terms of universal religion to expose the whole truth. Obermann and Senancour, who for the purposes of this portion of our study was also Obermann, had the misfortune not only, as we have seen, to be conscious of the infinite and the eternal, but to be conscious that he was apart from both. He was separated by disposition, through waywardness, fickleness, and the many moods of sentimentalism; intellectually, through an inadequate and narrow naturalism, born of trumpery philosophical reading, combined with rudimentary observation and a bourgeois outlook; morally, by an arrest in his development which places him in a lower groove of vulgarity and conventionalism than the ethics of the street preacher. by education through mere crassness and an eye for utility, by habit chiefly through the continual regard of vital matters in the light of their meanest part. All these grounds of unhappy experience severally and collectively instilled into him their bitter lessons. His disposition led him to recognize an ingrained incapacity, his intellectual outlook to regard life as abortive, his moral feelings to look doubtfully at the higher sentiments and the aspirations which are above evidence. His habits, his moods, his manners, to have no eye for beauty, truth, or sincerity in the presence of a defect, not so much because of the deficiency which it indicated, but because he happened to dislike it. We might collect almost by random score upon score of cases in point as to the mischance and miscarriage of his thoughts owing to these limitations of his nature. Observe him in Letter 81. Discoursing as a natural philosopher, as a kind of cosmologist at large, illustrating his absolute inability to understand the fundamental problems of philosophy, and creating an insoluble difficulty where there is no ground for doubt and no possibility of too educated views. The late creation of the universe, in other words, neither is nor can be an impediment to the human mind if we grant the fact of creation, nor yet if we deny that fact. In eternity there is neither late nor early, nor is it true that the universe subsists for a time only. It subsists, has subsisted, and will subsist for all time, which is simply the limit of the universe as regards duration, and outside it there is no time. So much for Obermann figuring as a speculative philosopher. As regards some other problems of the relations between God and man, their best commentary is that the writer changed his views. But we have said that he had also his ethics, and a specimen which will serve for the whole occurs in Letter 44, where he rails against those who would deny a true sanction to morality apart from religion, and yet in his turn is disposed to deny that, or rather it has never struck him to inquire whether there is a sanction for the aspirations of the soul apart from conventional doctrine. To suggest that such doctrine is only an accident of the soul's aspiration would have been to him a source of astonishment, though possibly also to his age, which had awakened sourly from the dream of the French Revolution, and for the moment loathed all that was blessed because it was itself unblessed. Though less apparent, and in some sense indeed concealed, a similar spirit is at the root of the lamentations which prompt such letters as the 39th, to which the true answer would be that in the last resource man makes his own sacraments. He chooses those which shall be to him the outward sign of an inward grace, and he makes them void at will. Yet the sacraments are always in the world, always ministering, and always efficacious. And now, as regards the habit and the bias of his thought, to take one instance out of many in Letter 44, Obermann forgets that faith in the first resource is an act of the will, and hence Pascal was neither absurd nor puerile, for it is admitted that he would have been right as regards conduct. But conduct is also a question of resolution, like faith, but in a narrower measure, because it depends more upon secondary considerations. It is a question of the determination to take a certain road, which experience has shown to be the right road, and it is open to any one to prove it in their own persons and souls on the one condition that they choose to do so. Wise or great, we have all of us indifferently the eternal justice to reckon with. After centuries of discussion, it remains impregnably certain that the consideration of eternity is the true sanction of morals, because it is that consideration which alone makes anything of any consequence. It imparts the one real and enduring vital import. It has been sometimes said that this is a mean view, but life itself is meanness, apart from the motive of eternity. I have mentioned these few instances out of many others which could be cited to illustrate the limitations of Obermann in the presence of the real problems of existence, as firstly questions of what Balmes, would term fundamental philosophy, and secondly, the grounds of morality, or alternatively the basis of faith. It is suggested by M. Levallois that in creating Obermann, Senancour intended to substitute for the man of his period, narrow in individuality and particular in sentiment, some ideal yet actual being, independent of circumstances, but capable of being affected by these, daring much and yet knowing how to govern his boldness, possessing exalted faculties, the germ of solid moral qualities, ardent sensibility, wide sympathy, a curiosity of knowledge assisted by unusual powers of contemplation, the desire of the permanent, the aspiration after devotion, but all combined with sincerity, disinterest, simplicity, and a singular passion for retirement. I do not think that this design is represented by the result as we possess it, nor does it seem to me more satisfactory as a description than some of those which we have already agreed to set aside as inadequate. M. Levallois has been himself at the pains of showing us, and I think quite successfully, from the first edition of the Réveillé, that some at least of the sensations and the personal ideas of Senancour enter into Obermann. I believe that it would be possible to take the whole of his literary work and to demonstrate by its analysis that the psychology of Obermann was the psychology of Senancour at the period when that work was written, and that, as already suggested, he simply circumstanced his hero within the lines by which he would himself have wished to be environed. There can be little doubt that he regretted his hasty marriage, and Obermann is therefore a bachelor. He regretted deeply and reasonably the loss of his inheritance, and he makes Obermann moderately easy as regards financial matters. He no doubt detested his enforced existence in Paris, and he gives Obermann all the world of mountains. Nor is this all. So great to him was the privation of his poverty that he threatens his hero therewith. So much did he detest Paris that his hero for a period is forced to share his misery. As regards the inner life, the thoughts, the aspirations, the convictions, and the burden of misfortunes, they are too real in Obermann for it to be worth insisting upon that they are other than the thoughts, aspirations, convictions, and burdens of Senancour. And the explanation and description of Obermann is that he wrote it because it was his own nature that he was depicting. If one more proof is wanting, we may find it right to our hand in the distaste that he felt for it very soon after its publication, his anxiety that it should be forgotten above all by himself, his anxiety to suppress it, overcome at length, after many years, only with difficulty, and only at a period when he was removed from it at a sufficient distance to be able to regard it, at least to some extent, as a document and not as a confession, the details of which annoyed and even harrowed him. I do not doubt that most of my readers will be able from their own experience to appreciate this point fully. We have all of us at some time and in some way laid bare our inmost selves and have shuddered at it subsequently, not at all because of what was revealed, but at the fact of the revelation, and we have invariably, I think, thenceforward sought to shut out the fact from ourselves rather even than from others, until in the course of time we have ourselves so changed that it has ceased to grate upon us. Well, then, Senancour wrote himself out at full length as he was at the period of Obermann. He believed in no God, unless law, order, and the fatality of both may, after some obscure fashion, have assumed in his mind something of the conception of the deity, and God is never once mentioned in Obermann. He despised all official religion, and Obermann speaks only with disdain of the dirty monk and the ascetic who is half a rogue. He thought that the only hope for man was by some such return to nature as was dreamed by Rousseau. And this belief is expressed not less fully in Obermann than in the Rêveries on the primitive nature of man, which are explicitly devoted to the subject. Finally, he did not believe in immortality, and this consolation is therefore denied his hero. But as I have mentioned so frequently already, the infinite and eternal were about him, even as they were within him. excluded as he was from all the grace of their ministry. He was conscious of their presence, their appeal, and their power, and because he could not respond to these, they overwhelmed him. And this excommunication, this consciousness, this weight, are all in Obermann. They are its sorrow, its greatness, its sublimity. They are its title to consideration, to place and permanence. They are what the boulevards did not dream of at the beginning of the 19th century. They are that which separates Obermann from the daily trade of Senancour, by which he bought bread for his children. They are separated by a distinction of kind and not of degree, even as the panis vivus et vitalis is distinguished from the bread by which men die. They are, in fine, the qualities by which Obermann has persisted after the lapse of 100 years, and by which I feel justified in offering it to English readers after all this lapse of time, even to the 20th century. What did this consciousness under such conditions produce in Senancour? What else was it possible for it to beget but melancholy and weariness, intense melancholy and unnatural weariness? In a word, the melancholy and the pessimism of Obermann, and the weariness, ever described, but always exceeding description, which recurs on every page of Obermann. End of section 3. Section 4 of Obermann. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Obermann by Étienne Pivert de Senancour, translated by Arthur Edward Waite, 1857 to 1942. Biographical and Critical Introduction, Part 4. My readers will scarcely expect that any clear and explicit account of the escape of Senancour from this condition will be found elsewhere in his literary work. No person was less disposed to write his memoirs openly. No person, having written the memoirs of his soul, took more pains to conceal it than Senancour. No person went to work more laboriously to disavow his share of all that was best in the work. The perpetual shifts to which he had recourse in the attempt to conceal the authorship of Obermann will be seen in the notes to that work. I have retained these in translating, though I must confess that they are for the most part so much beneath criticism that I am tempted to regard their puerility as a purpose of the author, part of the make-believe which he adopted in the hope of creating a distinction, prompted by his shyness and reserve, between Obermann, the writer of letters, and Senancour, the self-styled editor. Similar subterfuges are also found in the Méditation, and there is a suggestion of retrenchment and editing even in the unimportant Isabelle. But the works themselves atone for the silence and disavow the shifts of Senancour. Under what circumstances we do not know, nor does it indeed signify. His opinions changed with his nature, and his nature underwent a change of great importance and interest, which made it possible for the author of Obermann, year 1804, to be also the author of the Méditation, year 1819. We shall find that he who told us in Obermann how he was in search of other manners and a new nature, by some mysterious workings of the spirit, came to find both, perhaps in that quiet and unpretentious abode in the Rue de la Cerisaie. And the first thing that will strike the reader of the Méditation, should he ever come across them, is the absence of the note of weariness. From that mood, from that particular disability, Senancour has contrived his escape. There are more synonyms for weariness than perhaps for any other condition of humanity. It is one of the symptoms in chief, possibly the symptom par excellence, of the disease which is not life, but seems almost as inseparable from the normal existence of the thoughtful man as the quality of life itself. We may explain it by saying that vocation is the key of life, and that vocation, since humanity departed from the primitive nature of which Senancour dreamed but did not dream aright, has been nearly always misconstrued by humanity. Obermann is a history of weariness because it is a history of the want of proper occupation for the soul. There is no question, as we have seen, of the dignity of mere labour, of the law that those who will not work shall not eat, or any of the kindred delusions. It is a question of man's inherent spiritual energy and of its true object. Now weariness is represented in the Méditation as the share of those whom the world has subjugated. It is one of the fruits of our misguidance, and if Senancour is conscious of it personally any longer in his own spirit, it is only in the contemplation of the frivolities which dissipate the real strength of man. It is part of the yoke of our weakness, but we are still free, under the eye of divinity, to the extent of our power, primarily to abstain from consent to evil, and secondly to fulfil the law. From such burdens the way of escape is plain, and our first design should be to place ourselves beyond their pressure. It will be seen at once that we are breathing an air which is fresher, clearer, and purer. The weariness of Obermann is not the glorious fatigue of him who has ascended the intellectual mountains, and sinking worn out at some great height has still eyes to survey and a heart to be enkindled at the grand prospects which are about him. Nor is it either the fatigue, the exhaustion, and the despair of him who, having thus ascended, sees only blank voids of space. The weariness of Obermann is that of the dweller in marsh and morass, and of the follower of the false marsh lights. The solitary who speaks in the Méditation may be denied the Alpine peaks, and yet in the seclusion of his hermitage he has risen higher than Obermann, and so also the melancholy of the Méditation, and we shall find melancholy therein, since the highest creations of genius are invariably tinged with sadness, is not the sadness of Obermann. It is the dignity of religious sorrow which is alone able to set us free from so many sombre and useless sorrows. It is the sadness which is not hostile to peace, the sadness which must be experienced in the contemplation of the evils which surround us, and by which we are nevertheless directed towards a better life. And what is the lesson of this sadness? In 100 ways it bids us be engrossed only with reservation in present beauty, in this fleeting image of the invariable splendours. Here is the place of resistance, the region of expiation. Grow strong in order to subsist. There will be no need to invite my readers to make an express comparison of this melancholy with that which embitters Obermann. It would be impossible to describe the Méditation as the work of an acknowledged optimist, trading in a process for making the best of both worlds. It would be impossible to affirm that Senancour ever eradicated from his nature the peculiar form of pessimism which seems to have been implanted therein too early for us to know why it took root, but it is redeemed, modified, and transfigured in the later work by a perception of the vistas that are beyond this life. He still affirms that our heritage is suffering, shifting, yielding. There is no question of voluntarily renouncing happiness on earth. Such happiness exists not on earth. Having only to choose between afflictions that are sterile and others that are fruitful, he has chosen those which may at least lead on to joy. The sublime sorrow of the ages is an expression that would have appealed to him strongly, as I think it would have appealed to Obermann, but I know also that the author of the Méditation would have recognized that here we receive but what we give. The sorrow is an imputed sublimity projected from our own depths. Perhaps also, in a very real sense, the sublimity is also in ourselves. This truth was missed by Obermann, as we can infer readily enough from his 40th letter, where there is a touching description of the influence of the beloved on the lover. But had he shared the insight of Coleridge, he would have known that the transfigured nature of the beloved is really in the life of the lover. Perhaps there were times when he saw it in a vague way. There is a hint of it in the 78th letter, but it is narrower to say that man has no happiness except that which he imparts. The doctrine itself is one of the mysteries of the inward way, and we shall see later on that this had been in part realized by Senancour, and we are here on the edge of the secret of the great change which had come over him, a secret expressible and to be accounted for by the three words God, immortality, religion. The Méditations, in a word, are the work of one who, by a deep understanding of the law of nature, has at last begun to discern the working of the law of grace in the true and central place of all experience. The three talismanic words just enumerated could not, however, have exercised their divine sorcery upon the soul of Senancour, which for nearly half a century of its earthly existence had been deaf to them, apart from some wonderful awakening which gave him ears to hear what the Spirit from all time has uttered to the churches that are within us, and this awakening was as of one out of thrall and bond into freedom and all its hopes, capacities, and opportunities. Senancour had secured his emancipation. He was free to will and act. He was no longer face to face and paralyzed by an infinite fatality, apart from all discrimination, all pleading, all mercy. To exhibit the growth of his soul, as shown in the Méditations, we must then understand, first of all, that the workings of the mind had brought about in him a great change as regards the doctrine of the will. Let the reader refer to the 43rd letter of Obermann, which offers proof positive that we are nothing else in the universe than antic figures which a juggler dances, and in which the writer is divided throughout between his contempt for the man who has no higher notion than sticking to his business and his jealousy of the happiness which he may find in doing so. Wishing to be happy, but otherwise scarcely knowing what he wants, he discourses of the concatenation of circumstances and of the ruling of events. He would act, he would will, but he is without scope or object, and nothing therefore follows from the exercise of his volition. And it appears from many other passages that, albeit nothing is certain, so that the opposite of that which he affirms may be just as true, our notion of the liberty which inheres in will is on the whole more likely to be a part of the delusion which mocks us, rather than an essential appanage of the mind. The Méditations, on the other hand, recognize from the beginning that the own will of the individual man is on the whole better exercised in its abnegation, in which case this liberty of the just is truer and fuller and happier than the independence of license. And then, recurring to the philosophical and speculative aspect of the question of free will itself, Senancour takes in hand the objection that liberty in man, and as to whether he possesses it, is a thing incapable of demonstration, and while admitting that we cannot explain freedom in our resolutions, replies firstly that we can no better explain necessity therein, that all reason has failed to establish anything absolute against the liberty of the soul, and that we must therefore admit the other indications of this faculty, the sentiment of which seems inseparable from the very movement of our life. If in this reasoning we may still trace an uncertain note, it is not the uncertainty of Obermann. Senancour has in fact recognized a great truth which I have already mentioned in passing, namely, that the highest things exceed evidence. He gives expression to this himself, and beautifully, when he says, "That which is true essentially is today, without palpable demonstration. That which has no existence after the terrestrial manner is that which is abstract and necessary. That which is set aside as chimerical is that also which is indestructible." It would be difficult to put more plainly the great and secret doctrine of the seeing soul, that its highest and best lights come to it from regions that are outside the sphere of the rational faculty, that the insufficiency of reason is written large on every horizon of the world of mind. I have indicated that the name of the deity never occurs in Obermann, a simple fact which was noticed quite early in the criticism of that work. I should now add, what has not been previously observed, that in one of the fictitious editorial observations appended to the 81st letter, it is suggested as certain that the alienation of Obermann from doctrines which he deemed accidental did not extend to fundamental religious ideas. Those who are disposed to take seriously the belated explanation of Senancour's personal opinions, which appears in the second edition of the Reverie, and wherein he claims to have been always numbered among deists, may make the most of this statement, but there is nothing in the text of Obermann to bear out the annotation, unless the existence of an infinite force having a fatal operation can be located among fundamental religious ideas. I agree with M. Levallois that it is difficult, not to say impossible, to recognize deistic doctrine or deistic aspirations in Obermann. It is not, of course, explicitly an atheistical work, though the Rêveries, which belong to the same intellectual period, have been so characterized by Sainte-Beuve. It is sufficient to say that in its misreading of the universe, any conscious realization of the divine does not enter into the horizon of the work, whatever private sentiments may have been cherished by the writer. On the other hand, this realization finds expression directly or indirectly on every page of the Méditation. It is only the madman, as they tell us, who perceives in the mixture of good and evil which characterizes the universe the sign of some fatal law. The disorder therein is but illusion, the order itself is divine. That which we call evil is the part which is least understood by us in the designs of God. It is true that the deity dwells for Senancour in heights that are inaccessible to man. The necessary God is inaccessible. None can presume to know him as he is, nor can his divine nature be revealed to us. Our inaptitude is so great that herein it becomes impotence, and even the allusion to that nature is for man a sort of profanation. We cannot affirm what God is. In so far as we can define him at all, it is by affirming that which he is not. Yet in him alone is reality to be found, and either human reason is but delirium, or the divinity reigns. Apart from the faith in him, there is no true grandeur, and even no interest possible to man. But albeit in his essence God is unknowable, in his works he is manifest, and the mere act of living is in a certain sense the attainment of a measure of the knowledge of him whose seal is set upon all that environs us. In certain strange books of rabbinical theosophy, in the great book of the Zohar above all, I have met with this doctrine of the unknowable God, in whose knowledge we advance for ever, and though the conception was not reached by Senancour along this byway of reading, it finds in both an expression which is analogous because it comes out of the heart of both. French naturalist or inspired Jew of Cordova, the abstract doctrine was combined intimately and wonderfully with a wonderful intimacy of possible union between the divine and man, which lifted, in the one case, the exclusive doctor of Israel into contact with universal religion, and in the other, the melancholy recluse of Paris, exiled from his mountain air into the fellowship, not simply of Rabbi Simeon, but of Plotinus, and apart from all official Christianity, apart from all conventional doctrine, into the fellowship of the seraphic doctor and of the author of the City of God. It is not, of course, a doctrinal concord, for these things are not of doctrine, but of experience, and their mode is one of sudden awakening and instant quickening. Even to Obermann, letter 40, a perfume, a sound, a ray of light, could reveal that there are other things in human nature than digestion and slumber. By such means the electric chain wherewith we are darkly bound is struck, as Byron puts it in a parallel passage, and whatever the object may be which creates the point of contact, whether a flower or leaf or ocean, it quickens us with pain or pleasure for our wounding or healing. We can thus see what was not seen by Obermann, why he was so affected by the jonquil, as he records in his 30th letter, namely because at the back of everything there is infinity. For the same reason a primrose is more than a primrose for Wordsworth and all poets, and so also the meanest flower that blows may bring thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears. This also justifies the insight of Paracelsus when he testifies that he who tastes a crust of bread tastes all the stars and all the heavens. There are two ways in which the meanest flower that blows may bring thoughts too deep for tears, and the first is so much rarer than the second as to be almost impossible after the first period of youthful sensibility. This is the spontaneous ecstasy of natural joy in the beauty of the outward world, and even in the least significant part of that beauty. The second is by the faculty of reading the meanings of the mind into all things great and little of the outward world, and this faculty, which in its measure is manifested in Obermann, transforming many of the pages into poetry, was possessed in his later years in a much larger degree by Senancour, when he had come to see that, great or little, in all and through all, the outward world manifests the divine which is beyond us. Whether or not it was possible for Senancour, with the full and rare sincerity which always actuated him, to claim that his intellectual position had been deistic in reality from the beginning, there can be no doubt at all as to his views of the survival of the soul after death, and as to the absolute change which came over him on this fundamental doctrine of all religion. The glibness with which, in constructing his bald Utopia, Obermann decides, Letter 14, that death ends all, should, in the first place, be noted by the reader, and then compared with the laboured lucubration on immortality which occurs in the 38th letter. It can scarcely be called reasoned, it is a train of ill-accordant thoughts. The dog illustration is not perhaps more unhappy than the rest of the performance. There is either a common ground of comparison between certain situations, in which case they do not counteract one another, or there is none, and in that case also they are not in opposition because they are not alike. Apart from this, why did it not occur to Obermann that some people might accept the dog? He had not, of course, read the analogy. Moreover, he sins against taste not less deeply than against doctrine when he suggests that there may be a comic side to the desire for eternity. Those who can conceive its object have a right to claim that object, and if it is denied them, they are defrauded. Such being the position of Obermann, unrectified, be it observed, by any emendations in the revised Reverie, it remains for me to say that the desire for immortality palpitates on every page of the Méditation. Wisdom, Senancour tells us, prescribes that we should do all in our power to deserve a perpetual duration, and by no means attempt to balance this life with eternity. He bids us indulge in the hope of entering into new regions, possibly when the phantoms of this outward world are dissipated by the breath of death, we shall behold the splendour of the heavens. This perspective, so beautiful for all, is more visibly suited to insatiable souls, to comprehensive minds, to those who suffer, or to those for whom the earthly illusion has lost its force. For himself, he would be carefully distinguished from men who have but a feeble hope of a future being, and above all from men who have the misfortune to regard it as chimerical. His express statement is in fact that those whom we believe to be dead have entered into real life, and they wait for our dream to finish. Happy are they who, like him, await immortality. The destruction of mutable things will not trouble them, nor will the flight of time weaken them. The belief is in a peculiar manner the advantage of those who are disabused as regards earthly interest and ambitions. Beyond the clouds which have massed about this our place of sojourn, they behold the gifts of immortal life. Our aspirations towards that life are already a warrant for our faith, because we can to some extent conceive of the celestial majesty, raising our humiliated spirits, but it is impossible to conceive of that majesty abusing our profound distress. The very arguments made use of to disprove the soul's survival go only to show that the ways of the divine are mysterious, and hence Senancour concludes that to die is to close an eye which is wearied by the uncertain light of torches, and to open it in the still light of the heavenly regions. For though death may change, and thought may for a time be suspended, death will destroy nothing, nor will suspension make him who meditates on eternity the sport of time. Annihilation is not in conformity with the order of the intellectual world. Here, then, and now, it is merely a time of trial, and the trial is beneficial, less or more, but it matters nothing when it procures an enduring tranquillity. O truth supreme! To live is to hope and to wait. To live now is then to be preparing for an unknown life. Now, given a God who in his essence and in the last resource is ex hypothesi unknowable, but in whose knowledge the soul may advance forever, and has actually eternity for its advancement, what are the modes and conditions of the progress? In other words, what is the doctrine of religion professed by Senancour? We must not expect in his case a too accurate use of terms, or anything really adequate in the way of definition, but we may expect that he has been taught something by experience and even by intuition. Let us recall in the first place the standpoint of Obermann as shown in the 75th letter, which may be taken to be typical and representative of anything else that has been uttered therein on the same subject. Religion, he there tells us, is a system of the wretched, that is to say, it is an anodyne invented by them or for them. We may, of course, accept the definition, and may add that it is perhaps for that class of the wretched who have been said to mourn but shall yet be comforted. That is not, however, the sense of Obermann, who intends to and does class it with the rest of all vanity and bitterness. The first thing that will be noted in the Méditation, though it is not the most important in the connection, is that Senancour reverses all this, and affirms that, even putting aside the question of the truth, which alone is divine, and putting aside also the question of supernatural origin, the most persuasive religion would be that which would center itself upon the suffering of man. There is perhaps no need to point out that, except accidentally or in the course of its processes, religion has very little concern with the alleviation of human or any form of suffering. Senancour makes also the mistake of supposing that these processes are of the moral order. Morality, considered in its whole extent, is the sole science to which we must cleave forever, the one alone which offers, together with present welfare, the advantage of not despairing about the future, of foreseeing a less trammelled existence, of quietly abandoning days that are drawn down into oblivion, and of discerning without terror, as we approach the end of our dreaming, the mysteries of the awakening. I must confess that this language is to me more than incomprehensible, for morality neither gives nor encourages nor makes possible nor concerns itself nor is in correspondence with any mysteries of the morning of the soul. I know, of course, that the mistakes on this point are of universal diffusion, and though obviously Senancour went astray with his century on the bonds between morality and religion, there is, I think, some ground for supposing that he included in his generic use of the term morality much more than belongs to that domain of our conduct. He says, indeed, most expressly, when we cease to misconstruct all things, when we divine in each disposition of the world a secret and a marvel, when we enter into that perpetual astonishment, we acquire rectitude by a kind of necessity, we become religious without adopting errors and tranquil despite of our impotence. Senancour therefore does recognize, though somewhat vaguely, that religion is in the first place an intellectual attitude, in other words, an exercise of the will, and among the first things which it shows us, as through a strange glass of vision, is the invariable manifestation of a universal cause. It must be confessed, however, that Senancour did not usually rise above the elementary religion of conduct, the region of copybook and maxim, governed by a complete manual of manners. It will come as a surprise to my readers, having regard to the above limitation, if I now attempt to connect Senancour, as he appears in the Méditation, with men who might be supposed to belong to a very different school. I allude to the Christian mystics, the investigation of whose literature I have pursued to no small extent and in a number of divergent paths. I speak, however, with knowledge when I affirm that there is a distinct bond of such union, and as a part of his spiritual history that bond is of interest, and from more than one point of view of importance. I propose, therefore, to indicate a few links in the chain of connection, and to institute in particular a comparison between the author of Obermann and a profound and distinguished mystic of the French school, with whom he exhibits a number of impressive analogies, and with one of whose works at least he was evidently not only acquainted but familiar. As mysticism is still regarded rather in the nature of a charge, it is a satisfaction to be able to add that, although my conclusion on this subject was reached prior to my acquaintance with the work of M. Levallois, the latter, while admitting that one must not dare to affirm mysticism of a mind so emancipated and a temperament so logical, yet bears witness that it is nothing short of mysticism which appears in the Méditation, and that he who defined religion as morality in the infinite wrote of God and of divine things, not indeed as those mystics who are inebriated with the sentiment thereof, but with a kind of calm and reposeful plenitude, everywhere reflecting itself, tincturing every detail, and impregnating even the least phrases. I suppose that the general connection between Senancour and the mystics must of necessity resolve itself into the fact that he, in common with these, had found that all things are within, that it is particularly within ourselves that our real blessings must all be sought. He is, of course, a signpost only on the road of the mystics, pointing to peace and retirement, the silence of the passions, the sufficiency of the second best, and the satisfaction and good promise of duty understood in no recondite sense, but to the heights and the depths, to the many mansions of mystery which are in the house of man, to the great desolations and derelictions, and to the great raptures, to these he does not point. Nor do I think that the mystic tendency of Senancour was first manifested in the Méditation. Even in the early Rêverie there is a species of averse mysticism, showing one side of the dereliction of spiritual experience with none of the consolations or the lights. I have also found in Obermann some secret ways and paths in which strange lights may be encountered, though again, and I would note here in particular the ethical discourse or manual, which, if I mistake not, is attributed somewhat fantastically to antiquity, what we find is the sorrow, the aloofness, the loneliness of the mystics, but none of their unction. In his 48th letter, Obermann approaches them more intimately, for he comes very near to the confession of universal sacramentalism, within even the Proanos, and we see that he is also in search of the lost word. He also listens for the eternal language, the voice which speaks forever behind the veils of the visible world. N'entendrons-nous jamais la parole qui anime l'univers? He asks in the Méditation. Letter 55 of Obermann may also be consulted with advantage in this connection, and more especially page 318 of the present translation. There are two aspects of the silence and speech of nature therein referred to. There is its eloquence for the mystic who knows that it is a sacramental world, and there is its silence for the mystic because the word which he seeks throughout it, though it is ever hinted, is never spoken intelligibly therein. It is also full of speech for the merely natural man who finds all that in his heart which responds to its outward voice, and it is also silent for another type of the natural man to whom its voices utter nothing because he is too full of weariness, satieties, and disillusions to have any ear for such voices. End of section 4.